for coming back and joining us tonight. Thanks to the folks that are here with me in person. Thanks to all of you at home. I want to invite you to take your Bibles now. Let's go back to Judges chapter 6, picking up with verse 22. And if I do what I'm supposed to do, we should finish up chapter 6 tonight, okay? So anyway, let's go to Judges 6, pick up with verse 22, and let's open up now with a word of prayer. Gracious, loving Heavenly Father, again, we are just so thankful to be together here in this time of being able to study your word. Anoint us all, no matter where we are. Anoint us now with your Spirit that brought your word together. Bring your word now to life as we come together to study it, dear God. So just bless us now as only you and you alone can do. Lead us through this time. Guide us and direct us. And we ask this as always in the name of our risen Lord and Savior, who is Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, now last week, you remember, we looked at verses 11 to 21 of chapter 6 and how God responded to the cries of the Israelites. This time, instead of sending a prophet, he sent an angel. An angel to Gideon who's threshing out wheat there within the winepress to hide from the Midianites. Now, this angel we talked about is more likely, he's more than a regular run-of-the-mill angel, okay? He's either an archangel or simply an angelic messenger from the heavenly court, or, as we get from verse 14, remember we talked about this where it just simply says, the Lord spoke to Gideon. Then most likely, this is, once again, the pre-Messianic Christ, who is now appearing in an interchangeable, identical form or appearance of God himself. Now in verse 13, we talk about that in response to the call that God is now placed upon Gideon. We see that Gideon does the very thing that the prophet, back in verses 7 through 10, told the Israelites not to do, and that's to blame God. That they should not blame God for what's happening to them. Why? Because it's their own fault. But remember, that's exactly what Gideon does. He starts wanting to put the blame on God. And then as we read in verse 15, when he realizes God is actually calling him now to step up and save God's people, Gideon then, he does the number one most human thing a person can do. He starts making up what? Do you remember? Excuses. He starts making up excuses. And the number one question he asks in making up those excuses is, but sir, how can I deliver? Or how can I save Israel? And in response, God basically says to him, well, you can't do it, Gideon, but I can. That's why I'm going to be with you. And then in verses 19, 20, and 21, we read about the first two ways that God then seeks to reassure Gideon. Remember, Gideon is one of these judges that needs reassuring. And he reassures Gideon that he's going to be with him through all of this. And he does it first. Remember the fire that came up out of the rock consuming that large meal that Gideon had prepared. And then secondly, he just vanished right there before Gideon's eyes. All right, now I want to pick up with verse 22. And let's look at verses 22 through 27 at this time. Then Gideon perceived that it was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, help me, Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace to you, do not fear, you shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day it all stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. That night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull, the second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that belongs to your father, and cut down the sacred pole that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here in proper order. Then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the sacred pole that you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had told him, but because he was too afraid of his family and the townspeople to do it by day, he did it by night. All right, So as we see, we pick up verse 22 and 23. In these verses, Gideon's response then to these first two reassurances that God gives him, his response. And now believing. So now believing that this person who was just in front of him was either an actual angel of the Lord or the pre-Messianic Christ. In receiving the call and go and set his fellow Israelites free, Gideon's first response is to now believe what is going to happen. What is his first response after realizing, hey, this was God I was just talking to? His first response is that now he's going to what?
Die.
Now he's going to die. That's his first response is, oh no, I am going to die. Now, before we fault Gideon on this assumption that he's going to die, let us remember, it was a long-standing belief by the Israelites that to see God face to face, it meant certain death. Now, there are three ways this was brought to them. Now, the most obvious reason for believing this came from what? Well, what has become known as the greatest wrestling event of all time. Jacob. Remember in Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 32, here Jacob, it says, wrestled with a man, or the man, all night long. A man, once again, to believe either an archangel or once again the pre-Messianic Christ. And in that section here, verse 26, where the man tells Jacob to let go of him, because what's about to happen? Do you remember the story? What's about to come up? The sun.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, the sun is about to come up. And that would mean that if they're still wrestling, when the sun came up, then that would mean what? That Jacob would what?
Lose.
Well, now he'd see his face. That he would see his face, okay, and then die. But the belief goes back farther than that. Go back all the way to Genesis chapter 16. Now, y'all remember, we studied this. This is the story of Hagar. Remember Sarah's maid, who Sarah gave to Abraham to give him a son. And after Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, she wanted to run away because Sarah was being so harsh and mean to her. But God, as she's running away, God comes to her and tells her basically, do not go. Go back and return to Abraham. And in verse 13 of chapter 16, we read there that Hagar is actually surprised that she has remained alive after speaking with God. But the biggest support of this belief that we can't hold this against Gideon is actually found in Exodus chapter 20. After the Israelites are given the 10 Commandments, okay? Now in verses 18 and 19 it reads this, they've received the commandments. Then when all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance. And they said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we will die. So the bottom line is, yes, he's afraid, but it's justified. It really could happen, but it's a long-standing belief among the Israelites. So we see Gideon actually has a good excuse to feel this way about it all. But here's the thing. Look at verse 23. Because it's from the second reassurance that even though God has now left Gideon physically, God has not done what?
Left the area.
Huh?
Quit speaking to him.
He's speaking to him, so he's left him physically, but he has not left him what?
Spiritually.
He is still with him spiritually. Letting Gideon know what three specific things? Well, there are three specific things that God then speaks to Gideon about. The first one, he says, peace, or you may have the word shalom. Peace to you or shalom to you. What's the second thing?
Fear not.
Fear not. Do not fear. And then what's the third one? How we know that what Gideon's thinking?
Thou shalt not die.
He will not die.
You shall not, you will not die. Okay? Now, as we continue on with this story of Gideon, which one of these three specific things that God just said to him in spirit will Gideon not remember? Which one of those three things do you think he's not going to remember?
Fear not.
Fear not. Do not fear. These words from God. He's not going to remember. So remember I brought this up because it's going to be on the test in a few minutes, okay? All right, so here we have this. Now pick up with verses 25 to 27 with me. Now in verse 25, as we see, God orders Gideon to now do what? To take a father's bull, tear down the altar of Baal, which actually belongs to who? The altar actually belongs to who?
Is it king or?
To Gideon's father, Joash. If you notice there in verse 25, it's pointed out that his father actually owns this altar. It's built on his land. He basically had it built, okay? So, kind of lets us know where Gideon's family stands at the moment. But not only is he supposed to do this, but you notice along, he's supposed to cut down the sacred pole that would have been placed there in honor. Now, some of you may have this, some of you may not. Some versions tell us it's in honor of the goddess Asherah. Now, this would have been located right next to Baal's altar. Now, the Asherah was a pole. Sometimes it could be a tree that had been planted there. Now, this pole stood beside the altar to Baal. Now, as Baal represented the male function of fertility. You know, fertility for the crops, fertility for the livestock, and fertility for children. Because you want lots of children to help you work the land. The Asherah pole actually then represented the female function of the fertility. So they worked hand in hand. They were joined together. Baal's altar, the male function for fertility. The Asherah pole, that was kind of like his muse or whatever. And that's the female function for fertility. But in a way, it's ironic then that Gideon is the one who God calls to not only tear down the altar, but to also cut down this pole. Because anybody got in your footnotes what Gideon's name actually means? What Gideon is translated to mean? You might have it in your footnotes somewhere. Gideon means to cut down or to hack down. So Gideon's going with his name, all right? But now, let's stop for a moment here. Because there's actually some controversy that surrounds this part of the story. Now, from most of the translations that I looked at, my New Revised Standard, the NIV, the New International Version, some of you have it, the New Living Translation that I know Mr. Harold and Sandy have, and even the Amplified Bible. When you read these versions, it comes across as God is commanding Gideon to do what? To take the father's what? 7-year-old bull and use it to what? First off, to tear down the altar of Baal, okay? And then afterwards, after it's been rebuilt, he then is to sacrifice the 7-year-old bull on the new altar that he just built. But now, do any of you, I know, like in the King James Version, it reads a little differently. This is where the controversy. So do any of you have something that reads a little different as you get into the part there in verse 25 about the bull? Anybody got anything majorly different?
Take the second bull.
Second bull.
All right, here's the thing, okay? Now, I know this can be found in the in the King James Version, the Common English Bible, okay? But we really find out about this in that complete Jewish Bible. Because from the original Hebrew text, that God tells Gideon to actually take 2 of his father's bulls. One bull, we don't know the age of it, and then the second one, that is 7 years old. The complete Jewish Bible reads this way: take your father's bull and the other bull, the 7-year-old. So the original text has it with 2 bulls. One older, more likely, than the other. Now, why there could have been 2 bulls, why the difference in translation, we don't really know. The only thing that it could possibly mean, that it took 2 bulls, for what reason?
Tear down the altar.
Because the altar was so huge that it would take 2 bulls to do it. But the bottom line is, does it matter if your version has 1 bull or 2 bulls in it? No, it doesn't. There are going to be differences in the translations, okay? The bottom line is, we don't really know why. It's just very good, very strong possibility that the altar was so big it had to have 2 bulls, okay? All that I know for sure concerning the bull itself was that the bull was actually a frequent symbol that was used to represent the god Baal. So it's quite fitting that what? A bull or bulls were used to do what? Tear down the altar for the god whose symbol is a bull then. So we don't really know why, but it is ironic that the one who cuts it all down, his name means to cut or hack down, okay? And that the bull is used to pull down the altar of the bull, okay? But as we continue then to read, Gideon is then ordered to do what? To tear it all down and then to do what?
Rebuild.
Kill the bulls.
Okay, well, first, but before he kills the bull, he has to do what?
Rebuild.
He has to rebuild it. He has to, the New Revised says a proper order. But basically what it means to rebuild it properly, the way what? Because see, there are specifications for God's altar. And he is to do it properly. Get it built. And then sacrifice the 7-year-old bull. And as we see then, what does verse 27 tell us then?
So Gideon took 10 of his servants.
Okay, and what? What's the last part of verse 27 tell us?
And did as he told him.
Huh? And did what?
He took 10 of his servants.
Okay, and did what?
And did as the Lord
And
had
did it
commanded.
at night.
Oh.
But what does it really
Come
tell
on,
us?
David.
You see in verse 27, in this verse, we now see for the first time Gideon actually doing what?
What God told him to do.
Okay? But he's also done something else here. What did I tell you was going to be the thing Gideon did?
Because he was afraid.
God has told him, do not fear. Fear not. And what's the first thing when he does it? He's afraid, and he does it by nighttime. Okay? So like I told y'all, we're dealing with a not a judge, very judge-like judge. Okay? This is one of those, he's not the perfect one. But even though God has said, Gideon, do not fear, the first thing he does, he shows that he's still afraid of it all. All right. So we go through all this. Now join me. Let's look at verses 28 through 35 then. When the townspeople rose early in the morning, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the sacred pole beside it was cut down. And the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. So they said to one another, who has done this? After searching and inquiring, they were told, Gideon, son of Joash, did it. Then the townspeople said to Joash, bring up your son so that he may die, for he has pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole beside it. But Joash said to all who were arrayed against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been pulled down. Therefore on that day Gideon was called Jerubbaal. That is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he pulled down his altar. Then the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and crossing the Jordan, they encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet. And the Abiezrites, who were part of his family, were called out to follow him. He sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet them. All right, so now, as we see the next morning, everybody comes up. They're upset. Why? Because the altar to Baal has now been destroyed. Which tells us that even though, who owned the altar? Whose was it?
His father.
No, it was his father, Joash. Apparently it was used too by everybody, though. It's probably still a community one. Even though his father owned it, everybody was using it. And then after searching for the one who did this, what happened? They began to search, wondering who it is that did this and what happens.
They wanted to put him to death.
Okay, but what happens before that? You're right. But there's something else that happens actually before that. The crowd, the angry citizens, are told what?
If you follow Baal.
Okay, now not yet. Don't go that far. They're told what?
That Gideon did it.
That Gideon did it. Which leads us to the question, who was it then that told on him? Somebody told on
Stitches
Gideon,
get stitches.
and most likely it's believed who would have done it then.
His
Had to
father.
been one of
Not
his
his
servants.
father. But who?
Had to been one of his servants.
One of the 10 servants ratted him out. So, one of those 10 servants were not a loyal servant, were they? Because what we're told is that they're inquiring who did this, and suddenly they understand, no, Gideon did it. Well, then they want him brought out. They want him killed. But the big thing about all this, though, is then seen in the response of who? Who makes the big response here?
God does.
Not God yet. Who? But which person?
His father.
The men.
His father. Gideon's father, Joash, who suddenly now finds him stuck where? Between the loss of his altar or the what?
Death of his son.
Death, the loss of his son. Now look at verse 31. This is one of the great things that come out of this story here in this section. Now look again at verse 31. Take a moment, kind of read over it again. I will give you a moment to do this. Okay, you basically got it. Verse 31 there. Now, as you're looking at verse 31, so in response, Joash basically points out then what specific thing? What's the thesis of his argument?
Let Baal defend himself.
Okay, so he's saying what? If Baal is a real, true God, then what?
He could defend himself.
Then let Baal take care of it. Then let Baal take care of it. Then let Baal defend or get revenge himself upon the person who destroyed his altar. Now here's the catch to it though. Because it is with these words that we should also be reminded of something concerning the story of Gideon that we looked at last week. Now, look back at verses 14 and 16. That we looked at last week of chapter 6. There's something here from the previous story of Gideon that can stand out with this. You see, remember back in verse 14, where it says, Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you. And then in verse 16, the Lord said to him, But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them. Okay? Now, what was it that God told Gideon he would do? That he was going to give Gideon what? Basically, God tells Gideon he's going to give him what? Victory. He's going to give him victory, but how's that victory going to come? It's not going to come the way that Gideon thinks it's going to come. The victory that Gideon's going to get is not going to be by his human strengths or abilities. The victory that Gideon's going to get is going to come because of what reason? What's the bottom reason there in verses 14 through 16? Gideon is going to get victory because of what reason? We've kind of mentioned this already. Because who's going to be with him?
God.
Because God. See, it's not going to be by his human strength or his ability. It's going to be because God will be with him. Because of God's presence and God's power. And he's going to do what? He's not just going to give Gideon the ability. He's going to do what? Go with him. And that means he's going to what? Protect him. Well, see, without knowing it, Gideon's father, Joash, has just done what? He's basically applied what? The same thought, the same thing concerning Baal, the god Baal. God is great enough to protect Gideon, so is Baal great enough to protect his own altar. So in his own way, he's applying the same thing to Baal. And as a result of what all was said, what happened? The people just suddenly did what? The people suddenly do what? They accept what Joash has just said to him. And as a result, Gideon gets this new name. It says it's Jerub-Baal. Jerub-Baal, okay? Which can mean anything from let Baal contend with him, or let Baal defend. Now, if any of your versions got a different meanings for Jerub-Baal, let Baal contend with him, let Baal defend. Anything different there in that last part? Okay, I'm just curious to see. All right, then look at verses 33 to 35 then. So here we read, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east, they encamp in the valley of Jezreel, okay? There in verse 34, basically what we're told is what? The time is what? The time has now what?
Upon Gideon.
The time has now come for Gideon to take action. And as we see, what comes upon Gideon?
Actually, 3 different ways.
The Spirit of the Lord. Especially according to the New International Version and the New Living Translation. Now, the complete Jewish Bible puts it, the Spirit of the Lord covered Gideon. All right? But the New Revised Standard, what I use, it says this, that the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. Now, the truth is, most folks, they don't like it. They don't like the use of those words, took possession, that the New Revised Standard uses. Why would most folks, even there are some biblical scholars, they don't like to read that what the New Revised Standard says. And how the New Revised Standard got it, that's somehow the editors of this one, that's the way they put it. But why do people not like that phrase, took possession of Gideon?
Refers to satanic stuff.
Okay, yeah, some people look at it as a satanic way. But the bottom line is this. See, it makes it sound as if the actions of Gideon, that what he's doing are not under his what?
Control.
Under his control. That he is possessed at this time. Now, it would be possessed by the Spirit of the Lord. But see, that's not what this means, to be possessed by the Spirit of the Lord. You see, to have the Spirit of the Lord come upon you, to cover you, even to possess you, it doesn't mean that the person has lost all control of everything they do. You see, to have the Spirit of the Lord come upon you is simply a way of stating that the Spirit of God has now done what for a person? What might the Spirit of the Lord do for us?
Empower us.
Very good. Empowers. It empowers the person to go and do what?
Do what we're called to do.
To do what we're called to do. To do what God is now calling us to do. The thing is, how many times have we failed to not go and do what God has been saying, this is what I need you to do? Maybe it's because we didn't stop long enough to let the Spirit of the Lord possess us, to come upon us. See, that's what we need to do. Gideon does this. But see, at no point does a person lose control of their actions. Their actions are still their very own. It's still what? Our choice. But if we would just simply let the Spirit empower us, that's the only way we're going to be able to go and do, say the things that God is calling us to do, and go and do the things He says for us to do. Okay? So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. But remember, who are we dealing with? We're dealing with Gideon. So join me now at verse 36. Because see, here's an example. We're going to have an example right off the bat. Even though the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, that Spirit is still not controlling him. So join me at verses 36 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, in order to see whether you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said, I'm going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me. Let me speak one more time. Let me please make trial with the fleece just once more. Let it be dry only on the fleece, and all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, and all the ground there was dew. All right, so what do we just have? What does Gideon need once again?
Proof.
He needs proof. He needs reassurance. Does this sound like somebody controlled, possessed by the Spirit of the Lord? Remember, it doesn't control your actions. You still have that control. Gideon still chooses, okay? Now, from this continued need for reassurance, we now have before us one of the most well-known stories found in the Old Testament. Gideon and the sign of the fleece, okay? We learned about this in Sunday school when we were kids, okay? Vacation Bible school. We've heard this story time after time. But here's the thing. Now, as we see Gideon, he asked God for a sign by laying a piece of fleece on the threshing floor. Now, a floor at that time in that threshing area, most likely, even though some say it's dirt, most likely it's actually made out of stone. Stone, blocks that have been put there because this is where they collect, okay? And they don't want it in the dirt. So it's probably a very clean stone floor. Now, the first request of Gideon for a sign is that he lay the fleece down the next morning, and what will happen? What's the first sign he asked for?
Fleece should be wet.
All right, that the dew be only on the fleece and not on the ground. What's the problem with this? There's a major problem with this first sign that he asked for? The problem is this. It's not an actual miracle. This is not really an actual miracle. This is actually something that's known as a natural phenomenon. This is something any of us can have done. See, the dew from the night, it would have naturally condensed upon that wool and evaporated from the stone floor. As the coolness of the night began to leave, as the sun would come up, warming up the day. Basically, the fleece or the sheep's wool would retain the moisture, while the dry ground would not. It would begin to evaporate as the heat came up, okay? Or it would be soaked into the ground. This is not an actual miracle, y'all. This is more what they would just call a natural phenomenon. This is the reason why Gideon then asked for the second trial or the second test. But now, before Gideon asked God for this second test, what is it that Gideon does first? As he's asking him about the second test or the second trial, he also asks God, first off, what?
Don't be angry.
Don't be angry. He asked him, don't be angry with me. Now, does what Gideon say sound familiar to you at all? It should. We studied this. See, what Gideon does and says, it's the exact same thing that Abraham did concerning the fate of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, we studied this in Genesis 18, Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, the angels come. They tell him that they're going to go to Sodom and destroy it because it's nothing but evil. But see, Abraham, remember, he knows what? Who's also living in Sodom and Gomorrah at this time?
Lot.
Lot is. His nephew Lot, who's like a son to him. Okay? And so remember, Abraham starts off, what if you find 100? What if you find 90? What if you, and he goes down. And each time, basically, what he says is, do not be angry with me. If I have found any favor with you, don't be angry with me. But what if you did this? You see, he kept asking God. So here's the thing. He asked him, don't be angry with me. But then he asked for the second test, which was what? This time,
Fleece be dry.
fleece be dry and the ground wet. And in verse 40, what happens?
So God
God
did.
did it.
God did it. Verse 40, God then performed a true miracle for Gideon. Now, from this story has always come then the following question. Is it wrong to ask God for a sign or for signs? Is it wrong? Now, to answer that, let's look at it this way. Now, the miracle of the fleece and the dew, that's not the true point of the story. No, the true point of the story is actually found in something else. What do you think? What could be the true point of the story? It can be found in the way that God does what?
He's so patient.
All right, it's still very good. It's found in the way that God responds to the signs that Gideon asked for. Notice, does God get angry at Gideon at any point? Does he give up on Gideon at any point? He's asking for these signs. Even back with the angel and the fire coming out of the rock and the angel disappearing, all the way to the fleece here. No, God always responds to Gideon in what way? With the true example of what? You said it earlier, Sam.
Patience.
Well, not just patience, but
Love.
love. But what's the word you used? Grace. Graciousness.
Well, see, in my verse 40, it said that God, that night, God did as Gideon asked.
As he had asked.
So God did exactly what
Yeah.
Gideon needed.
So he doesn't get angry at him.
Right.
He gives him still grace, which is always the overwhelming message of Judges. You see, the way that God responds in grace shows us God's willingness to not just work with Gideon, but shows us, it reminds us also of what? God's willingness to do what? To help us in the same way. To be gracious to us. Think about it for a moment. Throughout the Gospels, throughout all four Gospels, Jesus, over and over, he performs a large number of signs or miracles for the people. All the signs and miracles, they demonstrate not just the power of Jesus, but they also seek to identify who Jesus is. The thing is, Jesus knew that there was a human tendency within people to want to see a sign, to see a miracle. And every time, think about it. Can you think of any time in the Gospels when Jesus got angry about healing somebody, doing something to help somebody? Even when his mom, even with the very first miracle, when his mom comes to him and says, they're out of the good wine. He doesn't get angry. He just says, what business is out of me? I got more important things to do. But when mom asks, the son does it. He's a good son. But he never complains. He never fusses about it. Okay? He knows that people need this. But what Jesus also knows is this, that to truly receive and understand a sign or a miracle in your life, you have to do it in what way? You have to receive that sign, that miracle in what?
Faith.
Very good, faith. You got to have it in faith. See, in the Gospels, many people saw the miracles that Jesus performed, but many of them still did what? Many people saw him perform signs and miracles, but many people also still did what?
Did not believe.
Didn't believe. They ended up rejecting him. See, as we see in the story of Gideon, God does not mind giving us a sign to show us the way to go, to show us how to do the things he's calling us to do. I wish I had time. I would love to sit here and tell you about all the times Sandy and I have asked for a sign from God. And you want to know something? Every time we asked, God gave us the sign that we needed. The thing we had to do was what?
Trust.
Trust. We had to receive it in faith. God will give us the signs that we need. All we ask, receive them in faith and in trust. That's what Sandy and I did. There are many times throughout our life together, trying to decide where God's calling us to go, a new church to work at. Even with her job. There was one time we were asking for a sign from God concerning job, and God gave us the sign we asked for. And it turned out to be one of the best jobs she has. She's had her entire adult life as a dental assistant. So the point of it all is this, then. It's okay to ask God for a sign. But don't just do it to try and prove, you know how much God does, or to make God have as a test to see if God can do it. Receive it in faith. Receive it in trust. See, that's the one problem Gideon still has. He hadn't figured out exactly how to have the faith. But that's going to come, I believe. So anyway, let's stop here. I did it. I got us through chapter 6. So we'll pick up with chapter 7. Again, one of the best known stories next week we're going to be talking about concerning Gideon out of the book of Judges. So come back next week and join us, and we'll pick up with chapter 7, okay? And until we're together next week, take care, God bless, and goodbye.